Hello everyone, I'm Alex, and I'm here to talk about Psygnosis because I love them. This is a presentation about why I think Psygnosis is a very important part of our industry. And so I'm going to try and give a brief summary of me, just so you know who I am, of the company, where they started and how they progressed, the impact and the influence that I think they had on the industry, and give a quick summary. Now, Psygnosis is a very well covered company. There's lots of YouTube videos, excellent YouTube videos out there, lots of blogs, everything. I'm not going to try and repeat any of that too much, other than what's hopefully going to give you a summary of who Psygnosis are. But I am going to try and draw a summary that I think I haven't heard before. And I'm going to try and connect some dots, and hopefully you'll agree with my conclusion. If not, it's all good. We'll ask questions. So I'm going to whiz through this. So let's start with me, who I am. I'm Alex Sulman. I've been making games since '97. That's a funny but terrible picture of me that this guy, my son, helped me take. So I actually started making games right here in Cambridge. I saw an advert in the Cambridge Evening News, because that wasn't the cover at the time, but I love that cover. I saw an advert in the Cambridge Evening News for a QA tester at a local company. I called my dad and went, "Hey Dad, do you think I should apply for this?" And he was like, "You want to be in video games? Why are you calling me? You should apply." And I'd written my own fanzine, which I have a copy of, and I got published in CMVG, the Computer and Video Games. It was a big magazine at the time. I had 6 readers. 6 people sent me money to read my magazine. And so I sent it off to that local company. That local company was Millennium. I got a job, and 3 months after I was hired, they were bought by Sony. And so I found myself working basically first party for Sony, way back in '97. So I was lucky enough to work on a few different games working at Sony. The original Frogger, or the PS1 version of Frogger, the medieval franchise. I transitioned into design when I went on Primal. Oh, I used a laser pointer. Yay. Transitioned into design on Primal, PS2, worked on 24, and then worked with another Cambridge company, Ninja Theory, on Heavenly Sword. So lucky enough to work for Sony Cambridge for 11 years. And after a while, I felt like I needed a new challenge. I felt like I needed to go somewhere where I could see if I was any good. I'd only ever worked at Sony Cambridge, very proud of what I'd done, but was excited to go and see if I could do something new. So I went across the pond to California to work for Sony Santa Monica and work on God of War, because I wanted to see if I could cut my teeth, if I could cut it on a game that was already established. So I got to work on God of War 3. I was part of the hand-picked team that helped build the multiplayer component of God of War Ascension. So I got to work on a brace of God of Wars. At both Sonys, there were a few games that got cancelled outside of the games that got released, and there was a game we were working on here that got cancelled after God of War Ascension, unfortunately. All in all, I'd been with Sony for 17 years, and I felt like it was time to go somewhere new. So I got a new job at Blizzard, luckily. Got to work on the Diablo franchise, which was a whole new challenge. The action combat games of God of War versus the action RPG of Diablo. I joined right as Reaper of Souls was shipping on Diablo 3. Got to add some expansion content to that. If you've seen the update to the Treasure Goblins and some other things that I got to work on, super excited to work on that. I was at Blizzard for a couple of years. There was another project that we were really excited about that got cancelled. And so at that point, I decided to move somewhere else. DICE, if you've heard of DICE Digital Illusions, they were in Stockholm, they're their main office, but they also had an office in Los Angeles. So I transferred to them to work on Battlefield 1, but also to work on another game, which I was super excited about, which never made it. But I was at DICE LA for about 4.5 years working on that, and a bit on Battlefield 1, a little bit on Battlefield 5. And then most recently, I've joined ZOS, ZeniMax Online Studios, and I can't tell you what I'm working on there, unfortunately. David Bowie won't let me, otherwise people would come, and if I let anything go, I'd be in trouble. But all I can say is that I'm working on something that is, in my career, the most ambitious and exciting project I've ever got to work on. It's very much my jam type of game, and I'm very excited about it, and hopefully at some point we can talk about it, but not right now. So that's enough about me, just to give you a summary of who I am. The big thing I want to talk about is Psygnosis, obviously, but also having worked for Sony for so long. I never worked directly for Psygnosis, but I did work with them on a couple of projects. I was part of Sony at the time when Psygnosis were a big influence. So I'm going to try and sort of draw some parallels, both as a fan of Psygnosis and as a developer, and try and draw some parallels there. So Where did Psygnosis start? Well, you go back to 82. Oh, I've pressed the wrong one. There you go. We go back to 82, back to the 80s. Big hair and big formats. And Spectrum, Amstrad, Commodore, as we all know, were popular then. And a company called Imagine Software. Fantastically, there's some of their games right here. These guys helped found the company. Eugene Evans was in the newspaper as being a whiz kid at 16, making all kinds of money, you know, as a whiz kid programmer. Keep your eye out for David Lawson and Ian Hetherington. They're going to show up again. But the company was formed and had some success with a few of these games. Again, they're over there, which is so cool. Arcadia, Ardiddums, where you're a baby trying to get back to your little teddy bear in your crib. And they had quite a lot of success. Arcadia was a pretty big success. But this is the era of the 80s of cassettes and piracy. You know, we all know those stories about how that came to be. And Imagine were trying to find a way to combat that. So they came up with the concept of what they called mega games. And those mega games, because of the copying, I love this video. Terry Venables says that copying is great. From Amstrad, who made the Amstrad and the Spectrum, love that. So yeah, copying was kind of a thing and piracy was an issue. So they came up with these two mega games that they were going to make, Cyclops and Bandersnatch. We know this story. It's been on Black Mirror, as I mentioned in a minute. These adverts were in the press, trying to get everyone excited about a game that didn't even exist. They had an advert about reinforcements coming because the game's so big, we need more people. These are a big deal for this company. They really wanted to invest in these two huge games. And part of their piracy push was to build hardware, expansion hardware that you need to run the games in order to encourage people to buy the games and play the originals. A little prototype version of that. And what I want to do just quickly is talk about the mega games concept, because I think it's super interesting to look at this. Bearing in mind this is 1983, we're now in 2023. When you look at the description for this game, right, the idea is the player to enter a bounded world where everything is possible and you can achieve different aims according to the sort of game which you enjoy playing. This concept of free format games, the great depth of play achieved by having many interrelated objects. And this part is the thing that I get really excited about. Things to be avoided. No status line, which means no score, no lives, no timer, no arcadey stuff. Right, we're doing that now, right now. That's open world games. These are open world games. We build these right now. This is the thing. And this is 1983 when these guys were talking about it. To me, that is incredible to think. Could they land this in 1983? No, but the ambition was there, and the concept that we still today are building towards and building from. I think it's interesting to see how, even back then, Imagine we're at the cutting edge of what games could be and should be. Yeah, as I mentioned, there's the Bandersnatch episode. I'm sure we've seen it. It's fascinating to see how that parallels with the story. But the thing I wanted to spend a little bit of time on is, at the time at which Imagine were doing this, things weren't going so well for them. They started to struggle, and they were running out of money. And at the same time, the company BBC showed up and wanted to do a documentary all about game dev, and they came to Imagine at probably the worst time. And this little clip, I think, really summarises that.
But it's doubtful whether Imagine's problems are anything to do with piracy, schoolboy or professional, and the outlook now looks bleak. The only director left on the premises for the past week seems resigned to a gloomy future.
As you can see, it's fairly empty. I think a lot of people are going to the pub quite early these days. But they've had the video cassette recorder playing this morning. They've all been watching An American Werewolf in London. And you see they've been making flags and decorating the place generally instead of doing work. Because why bother? They all know that, you know, there's no point. No one will supply us with anything. So we've got no cassettes to sell. So the company come to a full stop. This company cannot continue trading for another week unless there's a cash injection of, I would say, it needs next week about £500,000.
But events take place faster than Everest predicts. Within hours, he's resigned. And when some of the staff come back from lunch, there's an unexpected welcome.
We'll leave the room, please. Why? Can you tell me? You all get off that, please, Michael. You will not. You will let go, please, Michael. Can you tell us what's happening? You'll get your foot off the door, please. Thank you.
can you imagine being like there at the time when this is like the documentarians are like, what is happening around me? This is just disintegrating in front of me. So the bailiffs show up and they're out of business. I think it's kind of a fascinating snippet of the industry. And so at this point, Imagine have gone under, and Lawson and Hetherington decide with their friend Ellis to try and recover something from the ashes of this. And in '84, Psygnosis are founded. And I think the spirit of Imagine in terms of the technology, the ambition, hang on to that, because I'm going to try and come back to that throughout this conversation, because I think it's important to consider where they started and where they ended up. So Psygnosis are formed, trying to carry on that legacy. Obviously the 16 bits are big at that time, so they go Amstrad, Amiga and ST. Obviously copying is still, piracy is still an issue. They haven't quite solved that. But they're new platforms, new options, new choice. And so they're connected with Roger Dean, a famous cover artist for albums, Yes, and Asia. And they get him to do some of the box art. They keep the Cyclops name, right? Cyclops and Bandersnatch never came out in the end. The Cyclops name was they obviously had a lot of love for it because it became the sort of action game brand for Psygnosis. Bandersnatch ended up becoming a different game, which will appear right here. So the Roger Dean artwork was a big part of making the games something you'd want to own. And I think that was one step, and you can see it from the boxes over here, one step of trying to make sure that the purchase of the software was worth it to try and combat the piracy. And of course, one of their big games we all know, Shadow of the Beast, and its beautiful box, its beautiful attempt to get you to own the original, not take a copy. Shadow of the Beast is obviously a significant game in terms of the technology that it was leveraged, that it used. This was actually made by Reflections, a team that Psygnosis were keen to sign up and work with. I think again because the ambition of Reflections and the technology they were trying to leverage resonated well with with the people from Imagine, with Psygnosis, who they wanted to be. So yeah, the box was incredible. The T-shirt, everything as we know. Shadow of the Beast 2 as well, Beast 3, the franchise, very big deal in those 16-bit days. And at the same time, while they were working on the Amiga and trying to push technology, they formed this group, the ATG group, the Advanced Technology Group. This group of people were sort of put together to try and push boundaries, try and find new technology. Again, trying to make sure that Psygnosis were at the edge of the forefront of new games and new technology. And in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, they started to really research into CD software and new formats that they could look at. And so Silicon Graphics were a big deal in those early 90s, and they saw Silicon Graphics as an option to really push 3D technology and 3D software. Silicon Graphics you probably know from things like Jurassic Park and the N64, obviously. SG was a big deal in the 90s. I remember using them at Sony and being very impressed with these little boxes and all that they could do, including the Network Tank game that we'd all play after work, but using all that expensive hardware to play rad little games. And so in the early 90s at CES, they put this demo together, and they were showing it behind closed doors. So again, bearing in mind this is 92, 93, still on the 16-bit hardware. Nothing else can really do this. The animation and the scrolling terrain. So this was shown behind closed doors at CES. Again, this really cutting edge technology. No one else could really do this at the time. ATG were at the front of it. So this was shown to many people, and it ended up attracting the eye of Fujitsu. Does anyone remember Fujitsu? They're kind of still around, but not really. They had this console right there, the FM Towns Marty, which is kind of a consoleized version of their PC. And they saw the technology that Psygnosis were pushing, very inspired by it. They wanted to find something special for their CD-based platform. So they did a deal with Psygnosis to make a game, and that game was Microcosm. A Microcosm again, right? This is early 90s still. Some of the, if I can skip forward a little bit, this is very, very inspired by Blade Runner. It's very much trying to be a movie, as a video game, as much as sort of CD technology inspired people to do at that time. So leveraging all this SG power, leveraging their ability to, their codec ability to compress video, get it all running. All the 3D modeling they built, all the texturing, which at the time was pretty great. A lot of acting of people from the studio.
In, just to make sure things run smooth.
Ready, jump in shot, and look awkward, okay. And actor 2, ready, go, look awkward, brilliant, nailed it.
Gentlemen, say hello to the good doctor.
So
Nobody else
nowadays we look at this.
Say hello to the good doctor.
Nowadays we look at this and it looks, you know, obviously it looks very primitive, but at the time that was, you know, cutting edge. And Fujitsu did a deal with multiple games. They were going to make follow-up games to Microcosm. Microcosm was on the front cover of Edge, the very first issue of Edge, the cutting edge magazine of the time. I remember buying this and being blown away by it. That's a shot from Microcosm on the 3DO. And that technology continued into Novastorm, which actually was one of the games they were going to do with Fujitsu, but turned into another CD-based, FMV-based game. They were also at the cutting edge of talkies, which is when, you know, we take the text-based adventure games and put CD audio over it with Eric Idle and Discworld. So another example of them kind of pushing that CD technology. And this is a game that I think gets forgotten a lot, Ecstatica. This was a very early 3D game using kind of ellipsoids instead of polygons. And people forget about this game, but again, Psygnosis saw this. They didn't make this, but they published it. They saw this technology and they were inspired by it. 3D was new. It was, how are we going to solve it? This is an entirely different way of solving it to the polygonal way that we use now. But this, you know, they recognized the ambition of this game and published it. Even though, again, we look at it now and it looks so primitive. But this could have been the edge of 3D if we'd gone that way. But obviously, we went the more polygonal way. Tries and polys. So again, trying to push that edge. So at the same time, early 90s, sort of 93, Sony, previous CBS games, became Sony ImageSoft, started trying to publish games, trying to get in on the video game craze, trying to publish games for the 16-bit machines. And that led to some work with Psygnosis and taking some of the movie properties that Sony had and turning them into games. I think even the people at Psygnosis would say some of these games are not their finest, but they sold extremely well. Dracula sold brilliantly. I think Cliffhanger, I think the story is Cliffhanger was made in like 3 weeks or something. They got the license and had to turn a game around, and they did, and got it out. You know, not maybe the most technological games, but that idea of bringing, you know, IP into software, you know, Psygnosis were you know, pushing that too. This is Phil Harrison. At the same time, Sony Europe was setting up its European arm. Sony was setting up its European arm. Phil Harrison and Chris Deering were a big part of that. And they connected with Psygnosis through the Sony ImageSoft to work on some software. Obviously, at this time, PlayStation's in the Genesis period, right? It's starting to happen. Hasn't quite been confirmed yet. And so they also do a deal with Sony Pictures to get some footage for a movie. And at the time, Psygnosis were using that SGI rendering tech to concept this experience, this kind of racing experience out. And so they did a deal with Sony to get that into this incredibly 90s movie, Hackers. I'm sure we've seen it, but I have to do this. I revel in this clip. It's so 90s, it's amazing. And keep an eye on what they're playing. We all have rollerblade ramps in our buildings that still, yeah, definitely nailed it. Some of the dialogue is amazing.
That's a nice score for a girl.
Oh, really?
Think you can do better? I'll give it a shot.
Bit of fluke in the background, bit of EDM. And yeah. Sure you recognize those ships. So yeah, so they got some of that technology into the movies and started to do a deal. And so around, I think it was around 2005, I think, Psygnosis became Sony Liverpool. They were fully integrated into Sony. Prior to that, they were actually publishing games on Nintendo, on N64, on the Sega Saturn. because they were a publishing company, but they became first party, became Studio Liverpool. One of the sister studios to Sony Cambridge that I work with, got to work with them, got to go to Wavertree House, you know, where they were all based, where they've been based for a long time, where I believe they still have QA. Sony still has QA there. So that ran until 2012, when unfortunately they shut down. But up until that point, you know, very influential, cutting edge, lots of technology. So that's just kind of a whistle-stop tour of where they came from. So let's talk a little bit about how I think they've impacted and influenced the industry. One of the things is the software, like I've talked about, right? So games like Shadow of the Beast, the way they were packaged, the way they were marketed, Ecstatica, Nova Storm, Microcosm, the PlayStation games. I mean, at one point, I think in around 95, 96, 45% of all PlayStation game sales were Psygnosis games. They were a big deal on PlayStation 1, and I think a lot of these franchises that we remember, we remember, again, the boxes are over there. Some of these great games, cutting edge of 3D. G-Police was a big 3D effect, PC accelerator card game, again, pushing that technology. So Psygnosis were a big deal at this point. So yeah, software, big deal. Technology, I think, I've mentioned some of the technology, you know, seeing something like Reflections, Shadow of the Beast, being inspired by that. The Microcosm stuff, you know, pushing the streaming, codecs, 3D modeling, working with SG, all the big machines. This is something that I don't think gets mentioned a lot. This is what's called a PsyQ development kit for an Amiga. Psygnosis were a big part of working with a company called SN Systems to develop this. This was designed to allow people to make it much easier for people to develop on the Amiga. That PsyQ system continued onto the PlayStation and became, at the time, one of the key ways that most Sony developers worked on PlayStation. They created the environment, they created the debugging, they created the interfaces. SN Systems are still around today. They're a big deal. I've said that a lot, big deal. They're a large influence, and Psygnosis were a huge part of driving that forward and making sure that developers were able to leverage the hardware. At the time at which Psygnosis first started working on PlayStation, they were one of the only people, they got the third dev kit, PlayStation dev kit in the world. That's how much Sony believed in them and invested in them. And I think part of that is because that FM Towns Marty, this guy, that hardly anybody knows over here, right? It never came out in the West, released Microcosm in the home of Sony in Japan. It was a moderate success in Japan. And I think it's safe to say that there was some obvious with what Sony was trying to do at the time with PlayStation. The FM Towns Mighty represented an early version of that, and I'm sure they were inspired by it. So bringing that together to push the PlayStation forward, combined with their work on the dev kits, they took what was originally like a photocopier style dev kit and converted it into something that, and helped be a part of converting it into something that anybody can use. I think the original dev kit needed like a special computer that they only found in one warehouse somewhere at Sony. That was the only way they could interface with the dev kit at the time. So they leveraged their sort of PsyQ and SN Systems to drive it forward. And also at the cutting edge of other technology, right? Wipeout Pure, launch title on PSP. Wipeout HD, one of the really early PSN digital games. Wipeout 2048, launch title on PS Vita. Wipeout Omega Collection with its VR mode. Launch window game for PSVR. So they continue to be really impactful on cutting edge software, new hardware, continuing that legacy of trying to be trying to always be on that cutting edge. Let's talk about the dev teams that they were part of. So we talked about Reflections driving Shadow of the Beast. Creative Assembly did the conversions of Shadow of the Beast. They're still a big deal, making Total War, the Total War series. DMA made Lemmings, another game that Psygnosis believed in and saw and thought was inspiring. They invested in, trusted them. DMA now make a little game called Grand Theft Auto. Pretty big deal, that word again. Traveler's Tales made a couple of early games like Pugsy on the Amiga. They've gone on to make the Lego Star Wars franchise. They're still around today. Evolution Studios spun out from Liverpool with Ian Hetherington and spun up a new team. They worked on MotorStorm, which was a big PS3 game, Drive Club, big PS4 game. Sadly no longer around, but had a big impact. Bizarre Creations started out as working on the Killing Game show, and then went on to make games like Metropolis Street Racer, Project Gotham Racing. Again, sadly no longer around, but they had a huge influence on the 360 and Xbox era. Real Time Worlds came from Dave Jones from DMA and Ian Hetherington building a company that made Crackdown on the 360, which had a huge impact when it came around. XDev was spun out of some of the practices that Psygnosis had, still around today, helping to drive third-party development on the PlayStation. Firesprite spun up when Sony shut down in 2012. They just put out Horizon Call of the Wild on the PSVR 2. And like I mentioned, SN Systems, they came from Psygnosis. So this is one publishing house that, as well as their own software, saw something in these studios, in these people, and invested in them and grew them. And a lot of people talk about Ian Hetherington, sadly no longer with us, as being a big part of that, right? Trusting people to push boundaries and find new technology. Even if the games didn't necessarily be that successful, the culture of the company was to push things forward. And the ATG group, that still exists in Sony today. I've got friends that work in ATG. That concept is still a key part of Sony, pushing technology forward, pushing third parties forward. So ATG is still a thing. And the other thing I think that's interesting is Psygnosis went through this transition, which a lot of developers didn't make, right? The 16-bit 2D era through to the 3D, the cutting-edge 3D era. A lot of studios didn't make that transition. Psygnosis did, and one of the reasons why that transition was very hard, and I can attest to this having been around sort of around this time, Wipeout is a really good example of this change. Wipeout was made by about 12 people roughly. Massive game, sold millions of units around the world. The direct sequel that came out 2 years later, the team size doubled. More than 30 people worked on 2097 in the course of one game, one sequel. This was the era when technology, business, professionalism, marketing exploded, and games became much more challenging, but also much more supported experiences. And that's a really hard transition to make, to go from small teams to big teams, even just doubling. Now, obviously, we're at hundreds of people. But that transition was really hard, and Psygnosis were able to do it and able to be successful. 2097, arguably as good as, if not better, than the original Wipeout. So they were able to transition through that. And I think if you excuse the pun, I think a kind of a microcosm of what was going on in the industry at that time. And then finally, let's talk about marketing. If you remember, obviously the early 80s, late 80s, early 90s, these were the kind of adverts we were looking at, right? Shift happens, mum's tuna casserole, whatever this is. Obviously, we know what that's trying to be. Kick some balls, have your mum conserve, 190. And even these two games, right, from the Saturn and the 32X, Sega, Sony's direct competition. These were the adverts, sort of 8 to 14-year-old boys, just like it had always been. No real change in what who the games were trying to market to. And Sony took that same step in the early days. This is one of the early adverts for the PlayStation.
I'd like to talk to you about a menace threatening humanity. It's happening right here, in our very homes, and corrupting the lives of our loved ones. Yes, friends, I'm talking about this. It may look like a harmless bagel toaster, but inside is a deadly donut. How do you know PlayStation is not a normal game system? It carries these telltale signs. Scientists say its effects are mind-boggling. Users lose all sense of reality and enter another world. Here we have a normal, healthy young man. And here we have a fellow who's been experimenting with PlayStation for only a few minutes. Proof that we saps must be on our guard. Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.
Now, I love that advert. I think that advert's hilarious. But you can kind of see what it's trying to write. Oh, kids, the adults don't know what they're talking about, right? Trying to take our stuff away. You can kind of see it sort of trying aiming at the same traditional market and the usual marketing shtick. Now, also remember at this time, there was a massive cultural change, more so in Europe, but a massive cultural change happening with electronic music, the club scene, these big club names that were, the mega clubs that were huge at the time. Music was changing, culture was changing, and developers were growing up, right? Developers were getting, developers that had maybe started a little younger and now growing up too. And I think Wipeout is a really good example of how indicative of that change. So this is how Wipeout came to be, and I think this is a great little summary of it, right? This is Mario Kart, SNES, love this game, Rainbow Road, 250cc, right, the hardest it can be. One of the main designers behind Wipeout was playing this, Nick Burkham, really getting frustrated with it one night and decided to change the music. So instead of listening to the usual SNES music, he made a change. He put some EDM on. Very 90s EDM. Now, if you look at that imagery, listen to that music, and then look at this, I think you can draw a parallel, yeah? I think there's some commonality there, and I think in many ways, to me, that's sort of what we're talking about, right? Playing Mario Kart, playing a Super Nintendo game, loving it, but being into the kind of trend and the culture of the time, and trying to marry those two in a way that's more grown up, more adult, if you like, more trendy. And this guy, Jeff Glendenning, was working at Sony as a in the marketing department at the time. Was kind of connected to the club culture, club scene. Saw what was going on with the marketing, you know, the SAPs and the more traditional marketing trends, and felt that there was something different that PlayStation could do. Wipeout being a really good example of that. How can we get this to, you know, more influencers, more trendy people? Bear in mind that there's no social media really at this point, right? None. It's everything you know about is through your friends, through your magazines, through what you read, what you hear. And he felt like there was a real opportunity to push PlayStation. I love this super cheesy picture. I couldn't find a better one, but one of the big clubs, several of the big clubs in England, Ministry of Sound being the first one, they built a PlayStation room for people to come hang out at the club, play Wipeout, play Destruction Derby, play Psygnosis games, play Ridge Racer, Tekken, the games that were out at the time. To try and bring a new sort of type of person, the people that have grown up with video games, like me, into that kind of culture. And it was hugely successful. They connected with bands that at the time were a big deal, you know, Left Field, Orbital, Chemical Brothers, trendy EDM bands, electronic music kind of on the rise. Obviously now this kind of music is very common, very, very expected. But at the time this was kind of was a new trend. The advertising was edgy, right? Sarah Cox here in one of her first performances, adverts for Wipeout. You can kind of, yeah, it's supposed to be about so fast, you know, so speedy, your nose is bleeding, but I think we all know there's a little bit of a drugs reference in there, right? You know, it's trying to be edgy, right? Trying to push that boundary, trying to connect with people that are of a more grown up than they were in the previous adverts. They connected with Designers Republic to do the artwork, who were famous for making cover artwork for bands at the time. They did a lot of the art with the teams and the advertising for the games. So again, sort of trying to push games into a more mature, more grown up, more trendy place. And I think Wipeout did a pretty good job. So that's kind of the main push on the impact and influence. I'm going to try and wrap this up now in a summary. So we talked about who they are, where they came from. We talked about the software they made. We talked about the impact and influence in terms of launching dev teams, pushing technology, influencing culture, changing marketing. But there's no doubt that the Psygnosis owl, the Psygnosis logo, both in software as Psygnosis and as Sony, it was common. You could see it in a lot of places because there were so many games. And I think a lot of the videos that I've watched herald the software of Psygnosis, no doubt. This owl is so significant and so resonates with so many people. But the parallel, the line that I want to draw between the dots is it wasn't just the software that we played. It was the development processes that they founded and pushed. It was the changing of the teams and the people behind the scenes that were making the games. It was a shift towards a different market, all of which wasn't just the software, it was what makes games now. Prior to Psygnosis, prior to this era of video games, games were for kids. Games were what they were. They were a narrower band. They were very successful, but they were a narrower band. I don't think Psygnosis are the only people that helped this, but they were a big part of that change where games like they are now are for everyone. There is no There is no narrow. There are niches within the games that are for everyone. There is not one niche that games are for. And I think not only in the way they're made, but in the way they're played and the way they're understood. Psygnosis were at the cutting edge of that. And I think it's summed up perfectly by this advert.
For years I've lived a double life. In the day I do my job, I ride the bus, roll up my sleeves with the hoi polloi. But at night, I live a life of exhilaration.
Of missed heartbeats and adrenaline.
And, if the truth be known,
a life of dubious virtue.
I won't deny I've been engaged in violence, even indulged in it.
I've assailed adversaries, and not merely in self-defence.
I've exhibited disregard for life,
limb
and property.
And savoured every moment.
You may not think it to look at me,
but I have commanded armies
and conquered worlds.
And though in achieving these things,
I have set morality aside,
I have no regrets.
For though I've led a double life, at least I can say
I've lived.
That advert genuinely makes me emotional, because to me, that's about 25 years old now. How diverse the cast is. There's no video game footage in it. It's selling an idea. It's selling something you want to be emotionally invested in. And games weren't that before that. And Psygnosis were part of that movement. And to me, that is what makes video games now. They are experiential. They are for anyone. They are inspiring. And I think not only in the way they were made, the way they were played, and the way they were shown, Psygnosis was a big part of that. And I herald them for everything they did. And as a developer that's lucky enough to continue to make video games and was around when this was happening, I'm grateful that they were able to have that influence and be a part of that wave, because I think it's made video games better for everyone. Before I go, there's a couple of podcasts if you want to listen to. Shout out to the Retro Hour. They have some great interviews with some members of Psygnosis, Mike, Ian and Frank. And if you get a chance to listen to this episode on Maximum Power Up with Jeff Glendenning, it's a fascinating insight into a lot of what I've talked about. He goes really deep on how that experience came to be. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, so any questions? Oh, I've got a question. So, early Psygnosis games. You know, with like say the Bitmap brothers had a very definite look.
Yes.
All their games had that certain thing. I think that about some of the earlier Psygnosis stuff thing. And do you think that helped to bolster them and their wares in the community, you reckon?
I mean, I think not only the logo, was a big part of it in the same way. It's funny. I remember the Bitmap Brothers logo. I remember their art style. I remember the Psygnosis logo. I don't necessarily remember their art style, because I think a lot of what they did was technology. It wasn't necessarily a uniform style. And also they published a lot of other people's games, because I think they were trying to, like I said, push that technology boundary. So, but what I do think is that being those developers, those people, that label, that Psygnosis brand was associated with, I want to play that because it's going to be something incredible. And Shadow of the Beast, Microcosm, those games were running in the windows of Currys. They were running in Akihabara in Japan, right? They were technology showcases. And I don't know if Shadow of the Beast is the best game to play in the world. I think the people that made it have said the same thing. But I sure as hell wanted to play it because it was just breathtaking to look at, and I still love playing it today. So I think I'd say it was more their technology than it was their style. I mean, Lemmings and Shadow of the Beast, they couldn't be more different, but they were both very unique and creative. And I think that seems to be the spirit of Psygnosis, is they were very much keen on, if you've got an ambition and you want to try it, we'll give you a chance.
Where can you, speaking of the PlayStation, do you know anything about the T-Rex demo?
Yes, the T-Rex demo didn't play. That was the video that didn't play. Thanks, kid. Yeah, there was a point in '93 when the PlayStation was first being shown to European developers. that they ran the T-Rex demo, which is famous now, the 3D real-time dinosaur, looked a lot like a Jurassic Park dinosaur. They ran that at Great Marlborough Street, which is where their studio was set up. The place was so new, they were just laying the floor tiles like a couple of hours before they had all the developers in to look at the hardware. And so they showed that T-Rex demo and wowed everyone. And I think, Grant, you were the one that called out that if you play Astrobot on the PS5, you can see that T-Rex demo reimagined. And I remember seeing that on the Demo 1 disc that came with the PlayStation 1, like that, the way that dinosaur came out of it. It was incredible. That was cutting edge 3D. So you're right, kid. That was a good call out. Thank you for spotting the slide that didn't work. Thank you.
Is there any companies you think that are currently striving towards what Psygnosis did, like another push towards in-game development?
Oh, that's a blinder of a question. I think the landscape's changed. Steps in technology and steps in hardware and steps in feature sets have slowed down. I think when you think about the transition from, you know, really cutting edge 16-bit Amiga games to CD-based games, right? That was a massive change. I don't know if those changes are happening as much now in terms of software development. I think they're more in terms of environment and tools like Unreal, right? The Unreal Engine is really changing the way people are making games. But in terms, and so I'd say Epic are probably one of the companies that are continuing to push those boundaries and, you know, and drive stuff forward in a way that changes for everyone, kind of like I think Psygnosis were doing. I think a lot of the big developers now are focused on either, you know, shared software or their own platforms they already have, and trying to sort of, there's new horizons now, you know, free to play and, you know, different ways to monetize and, you know, Game Pass, right? There's new ways to make games, so that's kind of changing the industry sort of broadly rather than any one developer. I don't know if there is any one developer that does it like Psygnosis. It's a very good question. Thank you. I have a question for you guys. Do you feel like I drew that line? Because the thing that I feel is really interesting about Psygnosis is they're very well covered. You can go and watch. Kim Justice makes great videos. There's loads of great videos about Psygnosis. But the line between what they were and what they represent and how that's changed gaming was what I was sort of trying to land. And I'm curious if anyone has any questions on that, if it made sense and if I drew those lines together.
You touched on a little bit about some of the development practices that they have developed. Yeah. Sorry, it's a bit of a tautology there. But you haven't really given much detail on that. Is that because there's some NDA issues, or you just hadn't thought to flesh that out a bit further about some of the changes and enhancements that you've hinted at that they've made to improve game development? I
think a lot of it is, other than listening to some of the interviews with people talking about how, you know, how they got the CD compression technology to work on the FM Towns and how they were using SGs, a lot of that is sort of lost to time, I think. My impression as someone that worked for Sony but didn't work for Psygnosis is that ATG connection meant that we were constantly working with, there was a room that was locked where the cutting edge stuff was happening across Liverpool, Cambridge, London. And so that element was naturally hidden, right? Because it was so cutting edge. We would sort of see it down the road where the new development environment, the new debugger, you know, new third-party tools new tools would come out. So I don't know. Yeah, having not actually worked, one thing I will say is I did get to work on Wipeout Pure. Sony Cambridge helped bring Wipeout Pure together. We helped a little bit on some of the tracks, and I got to use the track editor that they built for Wipeout. And it was mind-blowing how good it was. It was super easy to build tracks out, get the curves, the wall heights. Clearly somebody had put a lot of time into making those tools very, very easy to use so they could iterate on the games. And I think that just in itself is sort of indicative to me of what Psygnosis were about. And I think there's a lot of developers now that struggle with tools, they struggle with technology, and their games don't come together in the way that they could if they invest that time up front to make the tools, you know, as Epic's doing with Unreal, right? Investing that time into the technology. Games come out even better for it. They come out more polished, they come out less buggy, they come out more, you know, more cutting edge. So I think my little example of the Wipeout track, I think is sort of indicative of the larger push that Psygnosis had. But other than picking up on it, its stories and stuff, it's hard. Some of that's just, you know, like you say, just hidden NDA, lost to time kind of stuff.
Yeah, but toolchain is often invisible work that isn't appreciated, but that's a really good example of how it works well. Thank you.
From their software library, a question. So an alien lands and they say, what's Psygnosis? What's the one game you show them to demonstrate this is what Psygnosis is, what they made, this is what they're famous for? And also, what is your personal, the pinnacle of their back catalogue?
So if it was me, I would probably say Wipeout 2097 would be the game I would show. Even though it doesn't necessarily, I'd have to tell them a yarn about how that came to be, because I'd want to show them, you know, something on the Amiga. But I think Wipeout 2097 is arguably their most, you know, really good encapsulation of the technology, the style, the uniqueness, the ambition that sort of to me captures Psygnosis. My personal favourite Psygnosis game might be Wipeout 3. Which a lot of people get angry at because it was actually made by Wipeout, Psygnosis Leeds, because at that point Psygnosis had multiple studios. I think it was Leeds, it was either Leeds or Stroud, but it wasn't made by Central Liverpool Psygnosis. At that point they had multiple other studios. And as far as I'm understanding, there was a little bit of rivalry there between those studios. The reason why I love Wipeout 3 primarily is because it introduced analog control, and to me that completely changed the way I played Wipeout. So I think it's I always felt like it was the most playable version of Wipeout. Plus it has some really nice, just the visual style of it is really cool. The musical style of it was really cool. So that's probably my favorite, but that's kind of like picking between my kids, right? I think so many of those games are just phenomenal and will always, you know, Colony Wars, Walker, you know, obviously Lemmings. There's so many games they did that were just so cool, so breathtaking.
Great, thanks. Oh, and can you use some of your inner clout to bring back things like T-shirts, stickers, key rings, just a little bit nice for people who buy the games? Any chance of that coming back?
I mean, everything's going digital on Game Pass now, so, and various digital platforms, so I'm not sure. I mean, Limited Run do a great job of that. I love Limited Run. I love the stuff that they put together to keep stuff physical. So,
as a developer, how worried are you about, especially as we move into the more digital downloading, about how these games are preserved for the future?
Oh, yeah, great question. I mean, right now it doesn't seem to be on big publishers' radars on how to keep games going. I mean, there seems to be a certain amount of expectation that people will just figure out ways to get servers, you know, to run on games that have gone. I think it's a big problem. I mean, I'm a big collector myself. You know, try and keep a lot of the games wherever I can, and to see those games go away is tragic. What I would say is, as a developer, right, it can be easy to look at a game going away and go, you can't take that game away, it's ridiculous. But I think there's so much complexity, especially in modern games, with licensing, with music and, you know, cars or whatever, or sports, right? Those things, even now, it's really difficult to get a deal that's going to guarantee you can keep that license forever. And that's a really hard problem. As games have got more and more, you know, like Wipeout, right? Tied with modern, recognizable, real world, you know, developers or labels or brands, right? Those are deals that have been done for a period of time, and those games, how do you keep those games around unless you keep paying the licenses? And I think that's kind of a bummer, because there are games that, I mean, we were just playing recently, there's games that aren't that old that have gone away, presumably because the license for the vehicles expired or the music expired or whatever. So I don't have an answer to that. I think that's a real problem, other than the thought of a game that I worked on disappearing into the ether and never being retrievable again makes me really sad. I mean, there's games that I've worked on that never came out that will never see the light of day, and I think that's a bummer, because they're locked behind, you know, IP and NDAs and all that kind of stuff. And I get it from a company's perspective, but, you know, I put 3 years of my life into something that I loved, and all right, it didn't make it for reasons, and I'm not going to argue with those reasons, but it's a bummer that, you know, that I can't even show it to anyone. You know, it's just kind of I don't know what the solution is right now, honestly, other than if publishers and developers, you know, the big publishers really commit an effort to it. It's a good question, because I don't feel like there's an answer to it at the moment, unfortunately.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.